incoming Biden administration has signaled its intent to center human rights and democracy and broader universal values as a core part of its foreign policy and the re-entering of the United States in the world post-Trump. But I think it's important to state outright that that will be very difficult to do without taking head on some incoherence in what has been long-running policy, both in Democratic and Republican administrations, about how our arms sales are used, particularly in places like Saudi Arabia. So on a more positive note, I'd say there is opportunity in the confusion of this moment. Certainly the State Department, a key part of who gets to make these decisions, has been put through a lot in the last 4 years and stripped down to, we'll just say, not its best capacity. And in the moments that we have right now to talk about how we want our government to function and what we want the United States to look like in the world, we have an opportunity to get this right, I think, for the first time in a long time. So I think now is the perfect time to be having a conversation about how the United States, as Brittany said, puts this back into a structure that means arms sales and arms transfers have something to do with our broader national security, foreign policy, and other interests.
Sarah, same to you. Why are you excited that we're able to have this conversation today?
Two reasons. I think one is that, my job at Human Rights Watch is to influence U.S. policy toward human rights, promoting and defending human rights. And so arms sales, security assistance, that whole bucket of issues is one of the big ways that the US can do that around the world, whether it's a decision to sell to a particular country, a decision not to, conditions that the Biden administration might want to put on arms sales to a particular country that have to do with human rights, or the decision to stop or halt arms sales after a country has abused human rights. All really important pressure points. And the second is that, to Brittany and Rose's point, who an administration, who America, and how America sells weapons to nations defines the character of that administration. And to Rose's point, defines the character of the nation to the rest of the nations around the world and to their people. And so the incoming administration, if it truly indeed wants to prioritize human rights as a central tenet of foreign policy, this is one of the big ways that it can show that it is in fact doing that.
I want to stay with you, Sarah, because you have experience in the executive branch, and now you're at Human Rights Watch, where clearly human rights take center stage. So if you were advising the Biden administration, what would be your top 3 priorities when it comes to conventional arms trade issues?
Yeah, this is a really tricky issue for people in the executive, because human rights, while we believe it should always be at the decision-making table and should always be a consideration, is not necessarily going to trump, as it were, economic or other interests, national security interests. And so there's a lot for policymakers to weigh. We, of course, think that human rights should be one of those things. And so on that scale of things to weigh, I would say intelligence and information on partners. So on allies, partners, whomever we're going to be selling, transferring arms material, technology to, we want to know who these people are. We want to know their character. We want to know their patterns of behavior. And this is not just about whether they have committed war crimes or there's a mass atrocity going on. This is about, do they quash free speech? Can people freely assemble? Are they going to use these weapons in domestic law enforcement operations to crack down on peaceful protests? There's a lot of things that I think US policymakers should and must know about these partners before selling weapons. And I think, how they go about getting this information, how they process it, how they analyze it, that's for them to decide. Perhaps it has to do with the intelligence community, perhaps DRL, INR, all of these. I'm throwing out acronyms now, which is really wonky. I'm sorry. All of these bureaus within the State Department and Department of Defense should probably be involved in that, but that's certainly one thing. I think you'll hear echoed throughout this forum, the second thing I'll mention, which is halting arms sales and transfers to nations like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates with a clear pattern of violating human rights and the international laws of war. And then finally, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the United States should be preparing the paperwork to sign on to or ratify, in some cases, treaties that have to do with arms and weapons. And so you've got the landmines treaty, you've got the cluster munitions convention. We should be doing more on explosive weapons and making sure that that they are not harming civilian populations. And the United States should also be working toward a ban on fully autonomous weapons without a human in the loop. Lots of organizations call those killer robots, just so that you have in your mind what we are talking about.
And I would, of course, add to your list, Sarah, the reversing the Trump administration's policy towards the arms trade treaty as well. So I think, yes, there are numerous international agreements that the U.S. can join on to demonstrate that commitment and that approach of values that you mentioned. Rose, I'm wondering if you could talk about what that approach could encompass. What might it look like? Yeah,
I want to move a level higher, I think, and focus on the question of policymaking and decision-making itself. I think, as we've all referenced, the fact that arms transfers are kept so separate as a conversation from broader policymaking, what tends to happen is we've lost track of why we're doing most of what we're doing. And so when a moment comes, policymaking is a constant exchange, a give and take of interests, right? You have to assess, is what I get from doing this worth the harm? There's no version of a policy that's just all good. And perhaps if we can find one, then you are now president. But in that context, it makes it very difficult to have these conversations about human rights and about what we're getting, because we've for so long just kind of taken as a de facto that we give these weapons to people, or we sell these weapons to people in certain countries in particular. And so I think there's a few things. One is the word transactional often gets used in a negative connotation. And I'd like to actually re-embrace the transactional nature of a relationship. I think there are countries in the world that are deserving of real investment and real partnership because we have an alliance of values and an alliance of interests. But I don't think that's every country in the world. And what that means is we can have space to engage meaningfully with countries that have problematic records that aren't exactly where we might want them to be, and frankly, don't align in their interests for the world more broadly, but perhaps share a security concern or a particular need in that moment. If we manage to reframe our relationship with those countries to say, we're partnering with you right now because we both care about Al-Shabaab in Somalia, or we're both deeply concerned about the deteriorating situation in the Sahel, or we're concerned about, in the Saudi example, you're worried about Iran, we're worried about Iran. If we have these actual honest conversations with ourselves and with our partners, it actually opens space for a more honest and frankly coherent policy approach on these questions. I don't think that we can get to a place on arms trade that looks like what any of us are talking about if we don't start truth telling a bit more internally in addition to externally. And that may seem like a bit of a cop out, but it was frankly, while serving in the executive branch myself, quite jarring to see how often there was that disconnect between what seemed obvious on the outside and what the day-to-day churn required of how we approach these issues. The last thing that I would say is focusing on accountability is a really important piece of this. And I think that there's been a lot of progress over the years through a number of different approaches to try and invest in what I like to call accountability ecosystems in the countries that we do end up engaging with, particularly those that have concerns with security sector abuses, human rights abuses, and broader democratic backsliding. And in those places, ensuring that anytime that we do decide cogently and coherently that our interest in providing weapons for a security context wins the day, that we simultaneously pair that with investments in civil society in that country, journalists in that country, academics in that country, and other people that are able to keep a tab on what is happening, as well as ensure that the infrastructure of civilian rights and support and engagement is as robustly supported by the United States as what the rest of the world will understand to be a robust support for military and use of force.
There's a lot to do. Just even in those short answers, it demonstrates the sort of breadth of activity that really will be necessary to right the ship, so to speak, in terms of the U.S. approach to arms transfers, how they are used, to whom they are sold, et cetera. So let me ask you, Brittany, what would you like to see the administration focus on day one, within the first 100 days, or even the first year of the administration, as some of these things are sort of, executive order type things, and others are really systematic and systemic changes that Rose, for example, just described?
Like I said, day one, there are pending sales or recently approved sales that need urgently to be reviewed. And it's important to remember that we're not talking about a regular transition, right? We are talking about sales that were approved after significant irregularities reported by the State Department IG and that have been the subject of historic resolutions of disapproval in the US Congress, bipartisan resolutions of disapproval that were vetoed by the president. In that context, it's important to do an across-the-board review. It's not just one or two high-profile sales in the Middle East. It's sales of small arms in Latin America that are ending up in the hands of cartels, right? It all needs to be reviewed, and that needs to be day one, because they have to suspend, otherwise those weapons will be delivered. Day 100, there needs to be a review of the conventional arms transfer policy, which was amended to say that we can provide weapons to foreign governments that are going to use them in war crimes as long as they're not intentional. Well, guess what? That's not consistent with US law, and so it needs to be revised. And with that revision of that policy, there needs to be a top to bottom review of compliance with existing law. We at the ABA did a study looking around the world at arms trade policies, and what we found is that the United States has great laws on the books that are not enforced, right? We have a law that says you can't provide security assistance to a government engaged in a consistent pattern of human rights abuses. We have another law that says if a government misuses our equipment, then they don't get more of it. Those are two common sense rules. There's an exception, but it requires high level approval. I would say that's quite rational. These were enacted post-Watergate to deal with an unruly president. And you know what? Now's the time to revisit those laws and enforce them. And that would bring us a long way towards having a rational arms trade policy. And that means doing things like investigating violations of end use agreements. If the UAE sent drone technology or other arms into Libya in violations of a UN embargo, that should have consequences. And likewise for civilian casualties in Yemen. Within the first year, I think it's going to be necessary to look at the decision to effectively deregulate semi-automatic assault rifles and other small arms and ammunition. These are the real weapons of mass destruction that claim thousands of lives every year. And we have far too many terrorists and criminal organizations are getting their hands on those weapons. So the decision to relax controls on those should be revisited within the first year.
Thanks, Brittany. Before we turn to Sarah and Rose to answer that question, I'd love to pull up our first audience poll, which will look at what countries, you mentioned at the outset, Brittany, that in the first day we need to stop arms sales that have been particularly controversial, not just to the Middle East. And so I'm wondering if we could poll our audience to see where they think that arms sales should be paused on day one. So if we could pull that poll up. Here we go. Fortunately, the panelists can't vote, but I'd love the audience to pick up to 3 places where they'd like to see arms sales halted on day one. And Sarah, this is giving you time to think about your day one, day 100, and your first year answer. Oh, it says it only allows you to select one. Do the best you can. It's my first time using a poll. So the magic of polling will finalize this. And we'll get our answers here in a second. Okay, I'm not sure how can people hear me? Okay, I wasn't speaking, I was waiting. I'm not sure how it magically ends and how we get the results. But perhaps as we're waiting for that, Sarah, I'll turn to you to sort of talk about and here's the results. So it looks like overwhelmingly Saudi Arabia had the highest level. And of course, that's been the most controversial and most public in the resolutions of disapproval from the US, the bipartisan, as Brittany mentioned, the bipartisan resolutions of disapproval. But clearly there's other countries of interest and concern, and of course didn't include many countries that should also be considered. And I think that's where Brittany's top to bottom review of arms sales policy weighs in. So Sarah, let me turn to you in terms of what you see as the day one, day 100 and first year.
Sure. So day one, I mean, day one is so easy if we say just, halt these weapons to Saudi Arabia or UAE. But I want to take it in a slightly different direction, which is to say that I've been very worried over the past 4 years, 20 years, maybe, that the American people don't actually understand very much about what is happening in foreign policy. And that's not their fault. It is, I believe, because the administrations are not actually talking to the American people about foreign policy, values, principles, why we do what we do, we being the United States, not me. And so I want to make sure that if President Biden comes in and believes that we should have a different policy and how we are engaging in the world, that he talks to the American people about what that policy is. I want to make sure that the Secretary of State, if he believes that we need a different way of engaging on arms sales and security assistance with partners and allies, that he actually explains to the American people what that means, where their money is going in security assistance, where their weapons that are made in Ohio and everywhere else, where they are going, what they are doing, what our intent is, how we're going to monitor them. And then for the first 100 days, I mean, I think it is, Rose, you should tell me, because you'll tell me if it's possible to do within 100 days or not. But I feel like within 100 days, there could be a new framework for including human rights considerations within every single arms sale and security assistance deal that is going forward. And that would be within the conventional arms trade transfer policy and several other mechanisms. But ensuring that if you consider arms sales as like an Excel spreadsheet, that there is a column for human rights considerations. Can you check that box? Yes, we have considered the human rights implications and ramifications of making this deal.
So I want to remind our participants that they can use the Q&A function to ask their own questions. But I do want to ask you, Rose, not just what Sarah just asked you, but I do want to ask you, I think it's very easy for us to sit on a very comfortable panel in our homes and have a conversation about what the Biden administration can do. But I think all of us have been around in this town long enough to know that action on these issues is really hard. It's much easier to loosen restrictions on arms sales than to impose restraint on arms sales, partly because of what you all said, that they're very misunderstood as how they can be used as a tool of foreign policy. Many see it as a slippery slope for banning all arms sales if you talk about having certain criteria, or if you, God forbid, talk about human rights and democracy as a criteria for arms sales. Who does that not allow you to sell arms to in terms of larger national security objectives? So I'm wondering if, Rose, you can mention, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges that the Biden administration will face, even if they embraced the approach that we've all talked about here today? What's the reality of why this is so hard and why it will be hard for them?
I mean, not to sound too wonky, but there's so many equities at play here. And whether that's in Congress, where we do have, I'd say, historic change in the way that both Republican and Democratic members seem to be approaching these questions. When I served, certainly there wasn't a version of the world where you could imagine a bipartisan statement of rebuke to a president for sending arms to Saudi Arabia. That just was an inconceivable concept. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the window has moved on that, and that's real. At the same time, we do still deal with the fact that These weapons are made in towns across America where there are members of Congress who have to remain concerned about the jobs of their constituents, and that will always be an element at play. We have additionally, the complex conversations about R&D and how long those cycles take to develop weapons, whether that's for ourselves or for the broader ecosystem. You have longstanding partners that are accustomed to engaging with the United States in a certain way. And I can say certainly that if the administration were to take the approach of trying to reset the expectations of how the United States engages in the world, that would certainly be met with quite a bit of outcry from partners. And there would be a lot of diplomatic work that would have to go into normalizing and resetting the bar, which I would argue is worth it, but that's not an easy thing. And then there's the real difficult policy trade-offs when we are faced with, I think a lot of people like to say it's a question of our hard security interests and our human rights interests. And I think that's actually a false dichotomy. More often it's a trade-off between short and long-term interests. And the policymaking apparatus is much better at short-term interests than it is at long-term interests. But those aren't easy decisions when we're talking about a real security threat in a region facing us versus the long-term degradation of American credibility or broader American interests. And so I'm going to be the person at the 3,000 foot level, but this stuff takes a long time. The final thing I would say is just to remember that arms sales itself sit within this much larger ecosystem of security sector assistance, which includes financing other countries, providing them weapons for free, as well as the support and training and other forms of assistance that we provide military and police around the world for a bunch of different reasons, some very good and some somewhat questionable. But in that context, it's important to note, and we haven't discussed this yet, that particularly since 9/11, the infrastructure that supports that decision-making process and supports the implementation of these policies became quite skewed, where the State Department in the lead as the foreign policy part of the US government started off with something like 80% purview over the money that was spent, the countries it would go to. And after 9/11, as the war on terror ramped up and our engagement overseas became quite as widespread as it is, we've basically flipped that, where the Defense Department oversees 80% plus of the assistance that we provide to other countries, which the vast majority of that, frankly, in the State Department's control is still large FMF grants to Egypt and Israel. And so in that context, the hardest thing is going to be rebuilding and building anew an infrastructure of government capable of overseeing a policy that we want to exist. And that can't be overstated.
And Brittany, I want to follow up on something that Rose said, that some of these are sort of systemic issues, right? That they're just really hard to address in the context of all the other competing interests. And I want to talk about this pushback of cutting off arms sales to human rights abusers or less democratic regimes, because as you know from your time in Congress, but also just reading the newspaper, there's always this argument that if the United States doesn't sell arms to some of these countries, then some of our Russia or China will sell to them. And particularly with this larger theme of great power competition and I thought I would get away with a panel without using great power competition, but alas. But in that context and in sort of the frame that we've seen in particularly the last 4 years, how do we overcome that? If we don't sell, someone else will, and this is going to be really challenging for our place in the world.
I really think this is overstated. We did an analysis of arms sales to the Middle East. We found that 75% of all arms sales to the Middle East are NATO, right? So the United States is not competing with Russia and China in the Middle East. We're competing with the UK and France, right? So the issue there, we have a control of that market. Saudi Arabia spent over $100 billion in building an army, navy, and air force on NATO equipment. They cannot turn around tomorrow and buy Russian equipment that's second grade and not interoperable. So it really is overstated. They'll play that game. King Solomon went and visited Russia, and there are countries like India that intentionally buy from a lot of different suppliers to maintain their independence. But the reality is that you can't just turn around and on a dime and do this. I think the other thing that we need to understand is that if we cannot get our partners to not use our weapons to commit war crimes, then it actually makes us less safe if we continue to provide those weapons. And so we need to be prepared to walk away. And I think that what we have found is that the United States, sorry there, I'm back, apologies for that. If we sell our weapons to people engaged in war crimes, it makes us less safe, and we need to be prepared to walk away. And I think that it's very easy to fall into this false binary that you either provide everything or you don't provide anything. I don't think anyone here is calling for a complete suspension in arms sales to any partner. The idea is that you should use those sales and that security partnership and that training to leverage behavior that you need from that partner. And there was a study commissioned by DoD that looked at 10 of the key partnerships the United States has had over the last 10 years. And across the board, the United States fails to leverage its assistance in a manner that gets the behavior that we need, which leads to long-term stability, so that we don't have to continue to send our own troops in to stop terrorist attacks and continue to provide this assistance, much of which is provided on a grant basis, right? And I think the American people would like to see us transition towards dealing with our own economic problems in the pandemic, rather than providing grant assistance for 20 plus years to the same regime that's abusing its own people.
I want to pick up on the point you just made, Brittany, about sort of the economic aspects of this. And we have a couple questions in both the chat and the Q&A. It'd be helpful. Use the Q&A, please. It's easier for me to track. But in the Q&A about sort of the military industrial complex, the role of the defense industry, the sort of long-term, oft debunked argument that arms sales equals jobs or exports subsidize domestic production, which is true. But it's really that they subsidize and that it is profits for the defense companies. And so the question is, how do we rethink sort of the administration's or the executive branch's relationship with industry, the procurement process, arms sales, restraining military exports without damaging our U.S. defense industrial base? How are all of these things linked? Because those, again, are arguments that you hear from members of Congress that have companies in their districts. Are there things that we can do to debunk some of these economic interests and demonstrate that it's not a zero-sum game in that sense?
Well, I think Bill Hartung and others have done an excellent job of debunking that. And the U.S. defense industrial base does not depend upon foreign military sales for its well-being. It will survive if we exercise more restraint and we're more cautious about how we do this. We're talking about the idea that if you sell a weapons platform to a foreign government and they misuse it, putting a pause on deliveries of munitions, all right? We're not going to lose a factory in the United States because we do that. But we could very well lose the lives of American service members who are targeted by terrorists because they're very angry about civilian casualties in their country.
There are a couple of questions in the chat about transparency and how in the last 4 years in particular, in many issues, it's become increasingly more difficult to get information, or at least timely information, on arms sales, on recipients, on licenses, on negotiations, et cetera. And so I'm wondering if any of you would like to sort of take on this issue of what would we like to see from a Biden administration in terms of increasing transparency with regards to arms sales, which could also lead to accountability and oversight by Congress.
I mean, I think all of us in our prep had noted how important it is to reset the relationship with Congress. It almost seems like too easy of a point to make, considering that the Trump administration, frankly, stopped applying statutory responsibility. So number one, just going back to actually doing what Congress requires the executive branch to do would be a helpful start. But I think in general, more transparency is better. And particularly when it comes to the use of force, when I talked about the importance of accountability ecosystems in countries that we end up providing weapons to, the accountability ecosystem in our own country is just as, if not more important, to ensure has the tools and transparency it needs to operate. One of the things that always shocked me when I started digging into these questions was that the government itself has a hard time knowing the exact amount of support that it is providing any country at a given time. So many different sources and kinds of assistance. And to me, that's insane. As a regular citizen, it is crazy to think that the president of the United States could ask his or her most senior leaders, how much are we spending in Nigeria? And the answer would come back, we can't quite tell you that. But that's true. That's the reality. And so any and all efforts to increase internal and external transparency, reporting to Congress, the real hard and extremely boring work of changing how we track and report on things will have serious ramifications for the ability to hold ourselves accountable to human rights standards.
I want to pick up on this point you made, Rose, about sort of the really, it's not even challenging, it's almost disastrous relationship that the Trump administration has had with Congress. And if you even read today's reporting about the conversation about Yemen yesterday and staffers sort of flying off the handle at the administration yet again not informing Congress or not having a conversation with Congress. We've seen with regards to arms sales, the imposition of emergency powers for arms sales that Congress clearly did not want to see go forward. And so that relationship is going to take quite some time to repair. We're going to hear later this afternoon at this forum from two members of Congress who've been extremely outspoken in their opposition to particular arms sales. But I'm wondering if there are specific things that you would advise, and maybe Brittany, I'll start with you, given that you worked on the Hill. Are there certain things that you would advise the Biden administration do sort of on day one and to repair that relationship with Congress, which particularly on this issue, but which obviously would serve many other issues as well?
Well, I think a comprehensive review of pending sales would reset that relationship right away. And I think there's two other things that fundamentally need to change in the relationship with Congress. It is crazy if you think about it, that we continue with sales once a partner goes into a state of armed conflict, and that's not the subject of an affirmative vote in the Congress. I mean, we are providing sales and training and assistance, sometimes side by side, along with foreign military forces, and that does put our own troops at times at imminent risk of being pulled into conflict. That should require an affirmative vote of the Congress, right? And so there is a need to flip the script so that rather than the default is yes to all sales, it's yes to most sales, but if there's a war, let's pause, let's think about this, let's make sure this is really consistent with our policies and our values. The second thing that's really important is to understand how much security assistance is happening below the radar through clandestine and covert authorities. You know, there are whole private armies being run to the tunes of billions of dollars since 9/11 through both DOD and CIA authorities, and the Congress probably has no clue. If you were to ask them where are all the countries in which we are supporting, foreign militias, I don't think the Congress has that list, or very few people in the Congress do. So there's a need for oversight and hearings and transparency, and there's a need to rein in all these new authorities that were created post 9/11 that gave the Defense Department exemptions from the other legal framework, and also gave a lot of authority to the Commerce Department of all entities to be in charge of exporting weapons. That needs to be reviewed by the Congress.
I'm not sure if Sarah or Rose have anything to add to that, but I want to ask one last question before we move on to our next panel. And I hope it's a good introduction into that next panel, which is that I started my remarks today by saying, this is really, at the end of the day, this is about human beings, right? It's about whether or not our arms sales are being used to foment conflict, to cause civilian harm, or if they really are being used as intended, either for self-defense or other sort of foreign policy objectives. And this is also an issue that for those of us particularly that we've been working on for, I don't want to say decades, but for some of us it's decades, really the importance of getting people to care about this, right? That this is one of the issues that you see on the front page of the paper every day, even if you don't realize it's an arms trade issue. So one of the questions we had was, how do we get more people engaged on this issue? How do you intersect with the things that people are ready for the Biden administration to care about on day one? Things like climate change, healthcare reform, et cetera. So sort of as your closing words, how do you see that happening? And maybe we'll start with Sarah. I'll just go backwards this time. Sarah, we'll start with you.
A really difficult question, Rachel. Thanks for throwing it at me here at the end. I would say, the president who is currently in office actually did a phenomenal job of talking directly to the American people. I didn't always like what he said, but he did open that channel of communication. And I think that President Biden needs to do the same thing. And so if we are going to intersect all of these issues, if we are going to say that this is a really important part of our foreign policy, and if we are going to say that there's going to be a change and we're going to do it in a responsible way, then I think that direct channel of communication is really important, and we should be talking to the American people about it.
Thanks. Rose, to you.
I think that we're all having a really important conversation in the foreign policy community right now that I find encouraging, which is the humbling experience of the last 4 years and reminding us that the United States is a country like any other country, grappling with many of the same issues that we have been collaborating with others in other countries to address in their own homes. And I think there is a push to more directly link the conversations we have about use of force and security assistance and security sector abuses with the challenges we have at home around policing, around militarization, around the deadliness and the extent of weaponry available on our streets. And I see that as a really positive opportunity to not just tell Americans that they should care about these things, but meet Americans where their conversation currently is and help them understand the connections and implications in the foreign policy world. I would just say, one other front, I think we sometimes over technocraticize, that's not a word, but I'm going to use it. We overcomplicate this stuff. At the end of the day, what we're talking about, and I think most Americans understand this and think that we're being a little disingenuous when we don't say it this way. If an American-made bomb drops on the house of a foreign national, that person doesn't question whether the United States wanted that to happen. They assume the United States wanted that to happen. And that happens in our name, and it happens with our tax dollars. And I think when we have real conversations about why we're doing what we're doing and how we can prevent those sorts of things from happening, that we're going to have an easier time in including and energizing the American public and staying involved in foreign policy more broadly. People know when you're dodging.
Thanks, Rose. Brittany, last word to you.
The American people don't want to be bogged down in quagmires overseas. They want to support foreign powers that are legitimate and can handle their own security without our assistance, without our boots on the ground. And we're not going to be able to achieve that end so that we can get to focusing on the pandemic and our own economic issues so long as we cannot have a rational policy around security partnerships and arms trade.
So I think you can all see why I was so excited to speak with these three really smart women who have, not only vast expertise and knowledge, but a real passion for continuing this discourse, to having these conversations, and to having real policy change. Now, you've heard now for the last 50 minutes what the experts think. So I want to end with our last poll of what you all think the Biden administration should do in its first 100 days as we transition to hearing about how these weapons affect people on the ground every day. So you're being asked to pick one of the top arms trade reform fixes that the Biden administration could focus on in its first 100 days. So please submit your answers, and before we transition to the next panel, and Sarah Leah, I will give you the answer or the feeling of the audience, of the nearly 200 of you that have joined us today. And just thanks again to Brittany, Sarah, and Rose for not only a fascinating conversation today, but for the work that you have done and will continue to do in the next 4 years. Our work is not over. We just have new opportunities and abilities to make some much needed changes. So as we close here, we'll get the results and turn over to, here we go. So, it's quite close actually. So pre-sale human rights conditions and vetting, I see Sarah clapping her hands, but also working with Congress to require affirmative congressional approval, I think will be something that we'll talk about with the members of Congress today, and certainly something that Joe Biden himself proposed in 1986. So hopefully that will be something that we will see move forward. Thanks again to all of you, to our panelists, to our participants for joining us, and I welcome you to our second panel.
I think we're having a technical issue with Sarah Lee Whitson. This is Ra'id Jabbar. Welcome, everybody. We are trying to unmute and activate the video of Sarah Lee. I think we're figuring it out now. Sarah Lee, can you say a word?
Hi there.
Okay, we can hear you now. Okay.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Sorry, not a beautiful view behind me, but the light is too strong on my desk, so I had to rejigger the location. Radia,
هاي
كيفك حبيبي؟
الحمد لله كيفك؟
ماشي الحال، إن شاء الله كل شيء تمام.
ماشي الحال.
زفت.
الله يعين. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Inigo, nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you too. Also, Radia, hello.
Am I butchering your name?
Yeah, Inigo as well.
Inigo is good.
Yeah.
All right. I'm just waiting for a cue on when we should start. It says we're live. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel on at the Arms Transfer Forum. I'm very happy to join you today. I am the Executive Director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, and joined today with Radia Al-Mutawakkil, who is a director of the leading human rights organization in Yemen, and really a group that has done some of the most important, widespread, and thorough work on the war in Yemen, the bombardment of Yemen, the human rights impacts, the violations of the laws of war, with an extensive staff that has worked in unbelievably difficult conditions throughout the country to document the most egregious abuses, violations of the laws of war. That's our new dog that just walked in. Apparently he can open the door. And we're also joined by Inigo Arredondo Vera, who is an investigative journalist in Mexico, who has examined and investigated where US arms have ended up in Mexico, something I read about a little bit before the start of our panel today, to my surprise about the extent and proliferation of US arms and the manner in which they reach both the government and non-state actors in the country. I'm going to close my door. Excuse me. Excuse me. The purpose of our panel today is for us to get a better sense and a better understanding as a US audience responsible for the conduct of the US government about what exactly the impact is of American weapons that are proliferating around the world. I mean, Mexico and Yemen are sadly only two places where American weapons end up. And of course, the United States is, I believe, the largest weapons exporter in the entire world. But a conversation with our guests today will, I hope, give us a better understanding of the impact of these weapons, and not only the direct physical impact, but how they're perceived, how the United States is perceived in their countries, and what their own recommendations are to the US government with respect to these arm transfers, which particularly in the case of Yemen, which has received a great deal of attention, has just caused unbelievable devastation to ordinary people in the country. Let me start in the format of this panel, and I'm gonna keep time to make sure we stay on track, is to ask some questions of our guests and invite them to share their expertise with us. And then open it up to question and answers from the audience, and I hope technically that works. Let me start by just establishing the facts. First talking about Yemen and then talking about Mexico, because many may not actually be aware of the facts of US weapons in each of these countries. So Radia, I want to invite you to start by telling us what is the role of US weapons in Yemen? How have they been used in their country? And how are American weapons reaching Yemen?
So Yemen now is famous as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. I don't know if everyone knows that it is a man-made crisis. There is a war in Yemen where all parties to the conflict are committing horrible violations. One party to the conflict is called the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition, and they are leading a military intervention in Yemen. Those who are receiving, I mean, Saudis and Emiratis are receiving US weapons, receiving weapons from the US. So Yemen actually, even if there is a war, doesn't have to be the worst humanitarian crisis. It is the worst humanitarian crisis because of the huge lack of accountability. And one reason of this huge lack of accountability is arms trades and financial interest between some states like US, UK, France, and some parties to the conflict like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. We in Muwatana, we document violations by all parties to the conflict, and we also document, part of it is the attacks by the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition. We do an investigative research methodology, and whenever there is an airstrike that attacked civilians, we go to the field and we try to, among our research, we try to find remnants of weapons. And few of the cases we documented, we succeed to find remnants of weapons, and we sent them to arms experts, and in 25 cases where we could find remnants of weapons, they were US-made weapons. In these incidents, hundreds of civilians were killed and injured, and many of them are women and children. And in most of the cases, there was no military target, and nothing has been done after that. No investigation, no compensation, no redress, and nothing to the civilians. And still the arms trade are still going on. So beside the very direct, I mean, impact of the US weapons to civilians, because of these financial interests, the war in Yemen, there was no real efforts to stop the war in Yemen. There was no real efforts to help to hold all parties to the conflict accountable. And selling weapons is just like a green light for parties to the conflict to continue their violations.
Well, why are American weapons, just to be crystal clear about this, being used in Yemen?
They have been sold to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and they have been used by them. And Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, they trust impunity more than anything else. And they trust their allies, which is Americans. So they just use them to attack. It's supposed to be a war against Houthis. But the incidents we have documented, which is hundreds of incidents, it was not Houthis, it was civilians.
Mm-hmm. So the U.S. Congress has tried to block arms sales to Saudi Arabia on at least 2 occasions, and this was overturned by President Trump. And the U.S. has tried to end its own participation in the war in Yemen. I think people are not really aware that the U.S. is not just supplying weapons to the Saudis and the Emiratis, but is actually, from a legal standpoint, a participant in the war in Yemen. What have been your recommendations to the US government regarding the provisions of weapons and the US participation in the war in Yemen?
First, they should stop selling weapons, and they have to start investigation regarding the violations that have been committed using US weapons. And they should also support all the attempts of the avenues of independent investigation that comes, for example, out of the Human Rights Council, and support the avenues of accountability in general. This when it comes to Yemen. And as you said, the Congress did a lot of work in this during Trump administration, and the coming period will say if Biden administration is different or not. I mean, in the elections, it was clear that Biden support the idea of stop the war in Yemen and stop supporting Saudis and Emiratis, but we will see what's going to be happening in the coming days. And also the US, they didn't even ratify the ATT and Rome Statute. So this is the easiest thing to do. These, I mean, things should be ratified by the US.
I see. Well, I guess you answered the question about, well, what do you expect the Biden administration to do? I mean, on the one hand, President-elect Biden said during one of the presidential debates that he would end arms sales to Saudi Arabia, that he would sanction Mohammed bin Salman for his role in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and other crimes. But since then, some commentators have noted that the Biden campaign's language has been a lot more muted, talking about reviewing arms sales or conditioning arms sales, but nothing that matched the promise he made during that presidential debate. Do you or do people in Yemen have a sense whether President-elect Biden is actually going to keep his promise and end arms sales to Saudi Arabia?
Well, people, they hope that President Biden and Democrats were honest, and it's not like they are sure, but they hope. And it's going to be a really big shame if things didn't change. So it will show if what happened in Yemen through these years was just like a Trump administration or it is a US administration. If Biden just continue what Trump has done, then it's not Trump administration, it is the US administration. And it's gonna be shame because Yemen was used a lot in the elections, and Democrats used Yemen a lot to advocate to stop the war and stop selling weapons. So I don't know to what extent they will be honest or not. I would be surprised if they are not honest.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that we often hear, and I'm interested in your perspective on this, is, and we just saw that reflected in the earlier poll, that some people don't advocate for an outright end to arms sales. Instead, they talk about things like conditioning arms sales, you know, that they should condition them on I don't know, fighting the war in Yemen in a nicer way, in a way that doesn't violate the laws of war, or somehow using arms sales as a way to pressure Saudi Arabia and Yemen and the UAE and its allies to act in a less unlawful way in pursuing their war in Yemen. Do you think that sort of conditionality would have an impact on what the Saudis and the Emiratis and their coalition partners do in Yemen?
Because of the continuous of selling weapons to Saudis and Emiratis, all of these things didn't happen. So selling weapons to Saudis and Emiratis, it's not like only providing them with weapons. It is just like a green light for them to continue. It's just like to agree that crimes are committed without any kind of accountability. When financial interest is part of the system, part of the deal, then it's a lie that they will be pushed to change their way of the war in Yemen. If it could be happened, it will happen since the beginning of the war. It's 6 years now, and it's not one airstrike or 2 or 3 where civilians were killed and injured. It's hundreds, and in most of the cases, we found the U.S. weapons more than UK or Italian or France. It's just because Saudis and Emiratis they trust the support from the U.S. and maybe they just they know that they will not be held accountable by them. So I can't, as a Yemeni citizen, as a human rights defender, I cannot set the bar low. My work is to set the bar high. And I think that it's not even high to stop selling weapons at this moment. It's 6 years of horrible war with horrible violations. It is at least that the least that can be done is stop selling weapons to Saudis and Emirates. It's a message. It's not only not giving them weapons, it's a message.
So what do you think about the argument that the US will stop selling certain kinds of weapons to Saudi and the Emiratis, the ones that, for example, have been used before in unlawful strikes, but other weapons, they would be okay. So some of the weapons would be conditioned and even stopped maybe, but other weapons would persist. Do you think that kind of a partial approach to weapons transfers would be effective?
There are states who respect human rights. They just they banned their arms trade to Saudis and Emiratis without going through all these details. Just when it was approved by human rights reports that Saudis and Emiratis committed horrible violations, and some of them can be war crimes. So it's a matter of principle and ethical step to do. So I think selling weapons, any kind of weapons, to countries that committed horrible violations, and these violations are committed are documented in a professional way. It doesn't make that big difference. As I said, it's a political thing. It's not only a financial thing or the kind of weapons. It's a political message.
And then finally, not finally, 2 questions after this, but what do you think about the argument that, well, if the US doesn't sell them weapons, the Russians will, or the Chinese will, or the Czechs will, or somebody else will. And so it doesn't, we shouldn't really stop selling weapons because we give up our influence and other people are going to sell them the weapons anyway.
Yeah, I've heard this, and it is a little bit weird that such argument is there at the first place. It's just like saying, if I didn't kill these people, then another criminal will kill them. And I said it's not. So what if other states had sold weapons, but not the US? I don't know what's the problem. But as I said, it's not it's not that Saudis and Emiratis doesn't already have enough weapons to destroy Yemen. They already have the weapons and they can continue. It's not that they don't have the weapons. It's because they are still receiving weapons and still have these arms trade from the US. They still have the impunity, and they still not, there is no strong push for accountability. So I don't know, it's a little, I mean, it's shame that such argument is there.
And this week, Secretary Pompeo, in his few remaining hours as Secretary of State, announced that he's going to impose sanctions on Ansar Allah and designate them as terrorists. How is that being received in Yemen? What do you think the impact will be?
Well, actually, I want to ask Pompeo and his administration, what will the impact will be in Houthis? How Houthis are going to be held accountable by this designation? How this are going to help to end the war in Yemen? Such political decision will just influence civilians. It will influence Yemenis in general, and it will help Houthis to work more in their propaganda that they are against the US. It might help Houthis, but it will affect us negatively. I mean, the Yemenis. We are stuck, I mean, among crazy armed groups and a very wild, I mean, neighbors, and a very, I'm sorry to say this, but a very dirty political, international political, I mean, approaches. So many human rights and especially humanitarian NGOs, they say this will affect the humanitarian aid access in Yemen in general, but it will influence the whole, I mean, the whole hope to have peace in Yemen. So I don't know how this designation is going to help. I mean, I think it's the last gift from Trump administration to their allies, I mean, Saudis and Emiratis. But the problem, if Biden stopped this, then it is something that is related only to Trump administration. If Biden didn't stop this, then as I said, it is a US administration. But they wanted to do it through Trump. We will see what's going to be happened.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I want to turn now to Inigo, and I'm so self-conscious about mispronouncing your name, so I'm
Don't worry.
Over and over again in advance. I'm mortified. I want to ask you, first of all, to educate us, because, you know, maybe it's just staring into my own fishbowl, but I have a sense that Americans are pretty aware that the US is arming the main combatants in Yemen and causing, you know, unbelievable destruction of the country of Yemen. I think that most Americans have no clue about US weapons transfers to the Mexican government or how those weapons are used. And, you know, they might think that weapons are stolen, guns are stolen to gangsters. But beyond that, my guess is that there's no awareness. Can you give us an understanding of the reality, the facts about US arms transfers to Mexico, the volume, the scale, what kinds of weapons we're talking about?
Yeah, sure. I have been making a research about how the guns make to Mexico, like in the past 15 months. And at the start, I was looking under this narrative about the illegal guns that came to Mexico, to the United States to Mexico. No? And according to the official data, in the past decade, they estimate 2.5 million arms came to Mexico through the United States. But also, and these guns were almost in 70% go to the organized crime. So since the past 15 years, also the military, the Mexican army has been put it by the president in that moment, Felipe Calderón, in the street. So since that moment on, the violence and the homicides in Mexico has been rising. Just only in 2018, the official figure revealed that mortality rates from armed violence reached 70 of the total homicides, around 40,000 deaths. So, and this has been a really struggle in the past years, how much this violence and how much of this violence come with the guns. And in the context is like in Mexico, there is only one store that sells guns here, and this one store that is from the Mexican Army, and that store is in front of the headquarters of the Mexican Army in the Mexico City. Yeah, and that's it. There are only like 2,000 licensed to that is like from one person only. So there are like only 2,000 plus that can wear guns in Mexico, and the other amount of guns that are in Mexico that are illegal. So that's from one hand. So deepening in the investigation that I made is like we have like this world of illegal guns that come from United States to Mexico, and now the Mexican government is like really pushing forward to make a like kind of a negotiation with the U.S. Congress to make like bigger and more transparent laws to regulate this to keeping to happen in Mexico, like these legal guns. But also the other hand is the Mexican Army in 1995 have the approval from the Mexican president in that time that they could buy guns to another countries, and also they can resell these guns to the Mexican police, like police states, police municipal or municipal police. So that's another thing. In this context of 2006, when this situation, when the Mexican Army go to the streets and they have like a really combat with the narco or with organized crime all over the Mexican country, they make the Mexican police from the states and from the municipalities, they start to getting more and more arms. So that's the reason that the Mexican Army start to get more and more arms from the United States. So they have like a millionaire contract with United States, some companies that made arms, and they have been given to the Mexican authorities, and then the Mexican Army just resell these guns to the Mexican police. And in this time that I have been reporting like violation to human rights, there's like always implication of the Mexican police in some states. I have been covering Coahuila, that is northern and in the border with Texas, and also Tamaulipas. And those two states, the police have like really several complaints about how they manage to get operations and to get people behind bars or try to, or just like misleading all the guns that they have. Like some of the police had put like some arms in some scenes, like crime scenes that they don't have like arms, and they just try to create like statistics like they are like really making good job. So that's the two things that I have been researching, how the Mexican Army has resell these guns that they bought to the US companies, and also in these operations, the US certificates put us as the end user, the Mexican Army, but they just resell these guns to the Mexican police.
Just to follow up on that, are you suggesting that the Mexican Army is reselling these weapons at a profit for the Mexican Army, or?
Yeah. They resell these guns to the Mexican police, like in the 31 states.
But at a profit?
I should say so, yeah.
And are these weapons that the police units could not buy directly?
I think that's the only one that could make these buys is the Mexican Army, like in law. Like the president just they gave them permission in 1995.
I guess the question I have is this a problem? I mean, why is this a problem?
I think that the problem is like we really don't know how many guns the police are buying to the Mexican Army, and also this is not transparent from the Mexican government about these guns, and also we don't know who also are buying these guns to the Mexican Army, because they have like this kind of thing that if military and ex-military that is not in work right now, and they bought a lot of guns, there is no one that could establish a parameter of how many guns an ex-military from the Mexican military could buy. And then there are like a few points that mislead, and how are these police using the guns that come from the United States. A lot of cases have been pointed out in the past 6 years of how much the police had commit violation to the human rights by not using the correct way these guns.
So if you were to make recommendations to the US government now that we have a new administration coming in, what would they be?
I think that it should be like, in one way, yes, they have to control the illegal weapons that come to the United States from Mexico. There's like well known about how Texas and California are like the two most states that came the guns to Mexico. And perhaps it's in one way it's just try to stop that in a matter, but also like keep tracking to the guns that they sell to the Mexican army. We don't know why are they doing that, no? Because there's like for one side like the combat that they have with crime, organized crime, but in the other hand, we have been reporting for the past year a lot of like a lot of assassinations from the Mexican army to civilians. So that's another thing. Like if I don't know how if police states for one thing and the other for the military, if they like really know how to manage these guns and keep tracking of how these guns are being used in Mexico.
Yeah. That's interesting. Your focus is overwhelmingly on the issue of transparency and end-use monitoring, quite different from the situation in Yemen. In our remaining time, and hopefully the organizers will give me some guidance, I wanted to open it up to questions from the audience, and I'm supposed to get some texts for those to see what those questions might be. Let me check. So I'm just going to read off some of these questions. I think the one for Radia would be, are Russian and Iranian weapons also a problem in the Yemeni war?
Well, actually, Houthis, the Yemeni armed group who are controlling 20% of Yemen, they are backed by Iran. But Yemen is surrounded. So if Iran can send weapons to Houthis, they will just do it. It's very difficult to track this because it's not direct. Like the Saudis and Emiratis, they are in a direct war, involved in a direct war in Yemen, but Houthis are backed by Iran, and Yemen is surrounded. It's a siege by the coalition. So I don't know how they will just reach their weapons to Houthis, but Iran is a problem also in Yemen.
One question, I think this is one I meant to ask, is what can university students do working to advocate for divestment from weapons manufacturers? That has come up on a number of universities. Do you think that would be a worthwhile effort? Interestingly, both Yemen and Mexico have had extremely active and activist university student bodies that have been at the forefront of demanding political change in their countries. What recommendations would you have to American university students?
Do you want to start, my colleague?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Radia, why don't you take it?
Okay. So I was glad that many universities, actually, our students have contacted Muwatana and asked us to whether do interviews or participate in events regarding Yemen and the violations in Yemen, the war in general, and arms trade. And this is just show how to what extent civil society NGOs in Yemen and around the war has succeeded to turn the war in Yemen from forgotten to and to shed some light on the war in Yemen. I think they can do a lot. And in Yemen, especially in Yemen, every effort has an impact. So if the students in their own, way and tools started to talk about Yemen, about the violations in Yemen, about the violations by all parties to the conflict, not only Saudis and Emiratis. Also Houthis and other armed groups and the Yemeni government, and to ask for accountability and to ask to stop the war and hold everyone accountable, it will make difference. And to push their, on their government to stop selling weapons, or to push them to push more for accountability, or to push for peace process. This will do a lot of difference. Sure, for sure it will.
In our 2 remaining minutes, I guess, I would ask you to tell me what your impression is of the United States image and reputation in each of your countries tied to the weapons that are being transferred and used in your countries.
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
I was reading today one of the last incidents that we have documented where the US weapons were used. And I would say an airstrike in Yemeni governorate that happened in 2020. And this airstrikes, about 32 civilians were killed. And in this village, it was a residential area in a village. In this village, there was no schools, no health centers, no electricity. So I was thinking that maybe the only developed technology they have known in this village is the American bombs.
Yeah, and I think that the Mexican people are there think about like almost all of the guns that have been used in the past like 15 years, like by the Mexican army and also by the organized crime, has been all over from the United States. Like that's like a really thing that the guns are all from the United States, and that's like really easy to get one gun to enter to Mexico. So I think that perhaps we could try to like you say, Sarah, and pushing the idea to be transparent about the idea of being tracked into these guns on a legal way, and just to make clear and see how it goes, and perhaps like the Mexican Congress try to make a better and pushing hard to the US Congress and stipulate how we can manage to get this gun control.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That does leave us with a little bit of an optimistic message. I think that with that, I have to wrap up this panel, and thank you for your time and sharing your expertise and your experience about the impact of US weapons in each of your countries. So Inigo and Radia, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I've gotten the notification that that we're live for our last panel. And I want to welcome our guests and also to thank our audience for sticking around for what I think is the culminating event that I'm extremely excited for. My name is Dan Mahanti. I'm the director of the U.S. program for Center for Civilians in Conflict. And I have to say, I'm very honored to be able to host this last panel with two members of Congress who need really no introduction, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce them anyway. But before I do so, I just want to say to them and to our audience, I just want to recognize for a moment that this has been, at least in my lifetime, one of the most shocking and difficult times for the country. And as someone who grew up, like so many Americans, with tremendous respect for the institution of Congress, I want to add an additional note of gratitude to our two guests for joining today, and to thank you both for being here, but also for serving the country. And on a lighter note, I just want to add a personal request that if we're going to keep doing impeachments every year during the NFL playoffs, can we push it back a little bit so we have something to watch before baseball season? I don't want to make light of a serious issue, but did want to kind of add a little note of humor, though. I want to note quickly before I introduce the two guests to our audience to go ahead and post questions using the question and answer function on Zoom. We're going to try to leave a little bit of time at the end for a couple of audience questions, but I know we've got a lot to address, so let's go ahead and kick it right off. First, let me start by welcoming Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who represents Minnesota's 5th District, which of course includes the city of Minneapolis. Her committee assignments include the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Budget Committees. And pertinent to this discussion, last year she introduced the Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act, and has then and since then been a vocal advocate for making human rights and atrocities prevention a much stronger feature of U.S. arms sales and foreign policy. Next, I'll introduce now a regular to the Forum on the Arms Trade annual meeting from California's 33rd District, Congressman Ted Lieu. Among his committee assignments, he serves on the House Judiciary Committee and House Foreign Affairs Committee. And also germane to the discussion, in 2019, he introduced the Arms Sales Oversight Act, and he's always been a strong champion of improving congressional oversight of arms sales, especially those that result or are likely to result in civilian harm or human rights abuses. So welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Of course.
Ed.
Let's
Hi, Ilhan. Good to see you.
Great to see you too. Let's go ahead and kick things right off. Now, we had structured a number of questions when we were planning this conference before last week, but because last week really is kind of the elephant in the room, it does offer us an opportunity to frame the discussion perhaps at a higher level of analysis. And I think with the events of last week, and even before that, a lot of us were wondering how to situate the importance of an issue like global arms sales or U.S. arms sales around the world, amidst these larger questions facing the country right now, questions of racial division and race, questions of political and social fracturing, questions of domestic and international accountability. So I'd like to pose the same question to both of you, in terms of how you see the issue of global arms trade and the United States' role as the unrivaled exporter of arms globally, in light of what's happening in our country, and how do you connect this issue or an issue like conventional arms sales with some of the experiences that we're sharing here at home, whether that's in Washington or at home in Minnesota or California. We'll alternate answers to the question. So I'd like to invite Congresswoman Omar first, and then we'll turn to Congressman Lieu, and then we'll switch to the next question.
Well, thank you so much for that question, Dan. And again, really excited to share this virtual stage with Ted, who I enjoy serving on foreign affairs, and just want to thank him and my colleagues who are helping lead the charge on impeachment and bringing about accountability. To your question, I do find it useful to connect to them. I think one thing we have to be very careful about, especially as we respond to the attack on our democracy that happened last week, is relying too much on militarization. One of the things we worked on last year during the protests around George Floyd's murder in my district was eliminating the sales of Pentagon equipment to local police forces, for example. And of course, we also sell those weapons to police forces around the world with records of brutality. To name a couple of examples, we saw U.S. origin equipment being used in Nigeria against the NSARS protesters. And we of course have seen the devastation caused by US security cooperation in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, especially in Yemen. So yes, this resonates at home and abroad, and we have a responsibility to respond to terrorism and to threats, but we often do it in a highly militarized approach with very little regard to human rights. And as we move forward from this really traumatic event that took place last Wednesday, we need to remind ourselves that this approach has not made us safer and has often meant going against our values.
Congressman Liu, do you want to add your own thoughts here?
Thank you, Dan. And want to say what a pleasure it is to serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. All of you should know she was actually one of the first members of Congress to introduce articles of impeachment, and she helped get the ball rolling. So thank you so much for doing that. And in terms of answering your question, I think one link is that this is about allowing a president to get out of control. And we saw, for example, with arms sales, that there were not a lot of constraints on Donald Trump. And when Congress tried to constrain his arms sales to Saudi Arabia, Secretary Pompeo came in and made up a fake justification, a fake emergency, then allowed those arms sales to proceed. And every time Congress did not constrain Donald Trump, I think he felt more and more emboldened. And then for the last 2 months, where we did not push back hard enough on the big lie that somehow this election was stolen, it was not. It further emboldened him, and he routed up his supporters. And then on January 6th, he incited a mob that violently attacked the Capitol, resulting in multiple deaths. So I think one central link is how do you constrain a president, both now and in the future? And I think Congress just has to do a much better job in holding the executive branch accountable.
Well, that's actually kind of a perfect lead-in as we kind of leave some of the larger questions relating to kind of what happened last week and get more into the meat and potatoes of the conversation at hand here around arms sales and arms transfers and security cooperation, which, as you both know, for a long time has been subject to some scrutiny, if not debate, around sort of the respective roles that each the executive branch in Congress plays. And some of those issues were really brought to a head in the last 4 years with, some of the cases that you mentioned specifically. The framing that we have now is that over the last couple of years, this particular administration, as you characterized it, Congressman Liu, seemed really committed to, not only, as you described it, sort of being not submitting itself to constraints and, restraint, but also as a matter of policy, really opening the floodgates for arms deals. In fact, making it really a matter of pride with the business community and the national security community. And a lot of the arms that went through those floodgates were those that were directed towards countries where they were used in the commission of serious crimes, human rights abuses, violations of international humanitarian law, or just devastating incidents of civilian harm. With that said, and taking a cue from your last comment, I can also hear, in conversations outside of both the Capitol and the state and defense departments, a murmur of skepticism that, the election of Joe Biden is necessarily going to usher in like a new era, that the Biden administration is going to see good reason to, deviate from the status quo or subject itself even to the additional oversight from a Democratic Congress, and likewise that a Democratic Congress might not be, too interested in, pushing the Biden administration beyond its set of sort of status quo anti-preferences. So, with that said, and just recognizing the political moment that we've got, and not wanting to put you in a difficult spot vis-a-vis the administration, still be curious to know what either one of you would like to hear or would expect to see from the administration on the issue of arms sales, in the first, days or months of the administration. And this time we'll start with Congressman Liu, and then we'll turn to Congresswoman Omar.
So thank you, Dan, for your question. I think one change that's going to happen is the Biden administration will actually provide relevant witnesses to congressional committees. For the last 4 years under Donald Trump, they pretty much had a blanket policy out there that allowed their witnesses to ignore congressional subpoenas, requests for information. They wouldn't provide witnesses to a lot of committees. I think that's going to change. And so we're going to have the relevant decision makers come before the Foreign Affairs Committee and provide testimony. So I think that'll be a good change. Second is I introduced last term, and will introduce again, the Arms Sales Oversight Act. So in the Senate, any senator can actually object to an arms sale and force a debate. I think the House should be able to have that happen too. A lot of Americans just have no idea about all these arms sales that are happening. And the fact that you're able to at least highlight the issue and force a debate on this, I think would be helpful to bring this attention to the American public. One thing that Congresswoman Omar has been able to do is to highlight issues and bring them to the public's attention. And I think on this specific issue, we could have a procedure that can formalize it so that any member can then force a debate on any particular arms sale. I think that will be helpful just to at least get the American public know that this is in fact happening and why it's happening. And hopefully the Democratic House and Senate will pass that, and hopefully Biden will sign it.
Congresswoman?
Yeah, I associate myself with those comments. It certainly would be a very welcomed change to certainly get testimony from the members of the executive committee to come and respond to our inquiries. But for me, first and foremost, I would want to hear the new administration say that they are re-examining the announced arms sales to the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. We had, unfortunately, the joint resolution of disapproval of the Emirates arms sales fail in the Senate. I led a House version of that resolution. I know Congressman Ted Lieu led his own joint resolution in 2019 for other sales to Saudi Arabia and the Emirati government, which I supported. But the Biden administration still has a chance to cancel those sales, and I believe they should. And they should also take immediate steps to remove the United States from supporting Saudi-led coalition in Yemen again. I think that has been made clear by members of the House, and the Senate has, Senate Democrats have continued to push for that as well. But I think you're right that this is a bigger problem than just the arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. We led a letter last year with, again, my colleague, Congressman Ted Lieu, with 17 other colleagues asking for the government to consider selling weapons to countries with human rights concerns like the Philippines, Egypt, India, and I think Hungary was one of the countries we included in that. I think for our own national security, we need to stop arming human rights abusers. This is, something that we have to do as a statement of values, which is why I introduced the Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act last Congress. And I plan on doing that again this year. When we see terrible human rights atrocities are committed with made in the USA weapons, it makes us less safe and it makes us less credible. And it is something that continues to really not speak to the values and principles we speak of on an international stage.
Yeah, thanks for that. And in fact, it will surprise neither of you if you weren't able to join the earlier sessions that the the pending and notified sales to both UAE and Saudi were a topic of frequent discussion throughout the course of the day. And you mentioned, Congressman Liu, the legislation that you had introduced, and Representative Omar, you had also made reference to your own. And I just wanted to ask a question about that. You know, this is one of those issues that has not always received a lot of concentrated attention or focus from the Congress, absent some, you know, motivating crisis, for example, you know, Saudi Arabia, or sorry, I should say the Yemen crisis. And part of that, I think, is because it can be either difficult procedurally, as your bill went to address, Congressman Liu, or because representatives and senators tend to see the issue of arms sales as you know, issues that they can't really touch because of domestic constituent concerns around, you know, the economy and jobs and so forth. And even so, we've seen, you know, just like your bills, we've seen other sources of legislative innovation. We saw, you know, a bill come out from the Senate this last year. We've seen a couple of independent initiatives from people like Senator Patty Murray. You know, is there a way that we can take advantage of some of the momentum to generate a broader base of support within the Congress for the necessary reforms, whether those are procedural reforms, such as improving the House's ability to oversee arms sales, or if they're you know, policy-oriented changes that call on the State Department or the Defense Department to do something differently. You know, what do we need to do to generate a broader base of support, both, you know, in a bipartisan way, but also bicamerally across the Congress? What are you telling your colleagues to get them motivated? What can we do from the outside? What do you think is needed, and how can we get there?
Who would you like to answer first, Dan?
Oh, I'm sorry. I think we're back to Representative Omar first, and then we'll turn to Congressman Liu. Sorry.
I think we have seen some cases, as you've alluded to, where Republicans have been on board with some of these initiatives. I think, you know, arms sales and the military industrial complex, the forever wars, all of those conversations sort of are somehow mainstream, and they're not. And, you know, we can do a better job at, you know, normalizing these conversations, drawing people into these conversations. And I think that oftentimes, as Ted was saying, you know, there aren't a lot of cases where the public is being made aware of these transactions. The public isn't being made aware of the domestic and international impacts that, you know, these actions have on our national security, the amount of money that is going into that's taxpayer dollars isn't really publicly talked about. And I think, you know, we had an opportunity with some presidential candidates where, you know, that was being normalized and having a conversation. But even if you think about, you know, the general election debate, none of these were part of the debate. It wasn't a topic. And I think that there are many opportunities and forums that could be created in order for us to broaden, you know, who is considered a consumer of this information, in order for there to be momentum build for different members of Congress to carry on this issue. I think right now it's a niche. There are a few of us who care about it. There are a few of us who have taken it on. Either it is, you know, something that is personal to us or something that our constituencies care about, but it needs to be something that, you know, that becomes part of the conversation, like healthcare is, or educational funding, or, you know, any of the other things that we care about, because it does have an impact on our economy. It does have an impact on our national security. It does have an impact on our standing in the world, and it does have an impact on how we see ourselves as Americans.
Thank you. Congressman?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Congressman Omar said. And I just want to sort of maybe explain what it's like to be a member of Congress. So every year, Congressman Omar and I will vote hundreds of times. And on most of those votes, we don't get a single phone call, text, email, fax, anything. And Congress is dealing with hundreds and hundreds of different issues. I can guarantee you arms sales is not in the top 10 of most members of Congress. They don't walk around thinking about arms sales. So when your organization and other organizations that co-hosted this event and are participating, when you go educate members of Congress or their staff, that's very helpful. Just simply bringing up these issues and just letting members of Congress know, especially new incoming freshman members of Congress, that yes, there are arms sales and Congress has a role in stopping them if we so choose to. And this is how the process works. And I think there's just a lot of education that has to happen. So anything any of you can do to help with that would be very useful. And with sort of every passing year, we do see more and more evidence of how some of these arms sales can go awry and then result in unnecessary deaths. So just sort of educating members of Congress and their staffs is extremely important.
That actually is a fantastic, both of your responses are fantastic and address some of the questions we're getting from the audience on steps that they can take. So very welcome intervention. And I think, both of your responses speak to this challenge that we have both within, the halls of government and outside of taking what has become a really technocratic or technical issue and restoring its proper place in the mainstream foreign policy and national security conversations. I would say as part of that, we're inviting a different challenge, which is articulating why sensible controls and reasonable approaches to arms sales are a good thing, especially as the national security community kind of, gears itself up for what it's describing as kind of great power competition. And I wonder if either of you, again, wanted to take a step back and offer thoughts on how the U.S. can be, a leader amidst its peers or amongst its peers, but nonetheless exercise, appropriate constraint with arms sales and ways that we can, again, help to articulate the value proposition as a matter of foreign policy and national security. And in this case, I don't actually have a preference of who goes first. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on this issue. Welcome either of you to provide some feedback.
Ilhan, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. I'll let you close on that. I think, first of all, as these are great opportunities. We really do appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation and be included in this discussion. As I said, I am planning on reintroducing the Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act. It's a bill that prevents arms sales, security aid, and security cooperations with any country that has been guilty of grave human rights violations. And I hope that you all will help us generate broader support for that. I'm also very supportive of Congressman Ted Lieu's bill that helps give the House greater oversight over arms sales. And I hope that you all will help us generate support for his legislation so that we can see it pass. I think it is really a long fight to make human rights central to arms sales policy, and with more conversations like this and more awareness to the public, there will be success in us winning this fight.
So Dan, when you mentioned great power competition, it sort of brought to mind that the point of arms sales is not to generate profit. That should not be the point. The point is to help the United States execute our foreign policy and achieve our strategic goals. So for example, we sell arms to Ukraine to help them push back against Russian aggression. I think most members of Congress are generally sort of okay with that. But I think it'd be helpful, for example, for the Biden administration to sort of lay out, this is why we sell arms to certain countries, and to have a strategy and a purpose, an objective and a goal. And if the new administration would do that, I think it's very helpful to to members of Congress and to explain to the American public, well, why is it that we sell arms to various countries? And maybe when they look at it, they might think, why are we selling arms to this particular country? And I think it's just helpful for their new administration to have a top-down review of our arms sales policies and exactly what goals they're trying to achieve with it.
Yeah, thank you both for those responses. Sorry, I stuttered there for a minute because I couldn't tell if I was on mute or not. I think we've all shared that experience, so luckily I'm not. And something you just said recalled another discussion that was taking place earlier in the conversation about some of the assumptions that go unquestioned when it comes to the value return on arms sales in service of foreign policy and national security goals. So I think your recommendation to do a review to assess kind of the assumptions and some of the beliefs that that kind of persist in upholding arms sales as kind of an unquestioned feature of foreign policy is something that that has come up in other ways. And as a part of that, there's the conversation about what alternative means the U.S. might have to advance its security interests. And one of our audience members has posed the question of policy alternatives and whether or not policy alternatives should be and could be a part of the conversation around arms sales. And the question, is formulated around whether or not we could look at alternatives to militarize sort of approaches in arms sales and look more at kind of conflict, ways that the U.S. can support, address conflict in other ways, perhaps from more of a human security oriented approach. And I didn't know if either of you wanted to offer any thoughts to the audience on kind of policy alternatives to the U.S. role in advancing global security.
So maybe I'll take this one first. So I personally think that investing more in foreign aid would be very helpful, whether it's humanitarian assistance or having more Peace Corps volunteers or having USAID do more things in more countries. I actually think we get more return on those dollars, sort of building bridges with other countries and helping other countries navigate through their problems that they're having. So if we could do that, I think that would be a welcome change with the new administration.
It's actually an excellent point, and it reminded me that a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, right after I got elected, I was on a panel with on a topic like this, and there was a man in the audience, and he was, I think, like in his 60s, and he said that he was in the Peace Corps, and he remembers going back to one of the countries in Africa that he served in, and he was talking to someone of his generation, so someone that was like my dad's age, and he said it's interesting because people of that age have an idea of America where their first interaction with the United States was with the Peace Corps. These are people who are coming to help and there's a peace mission, and it is buying goodwill. And there is a whole generation, he was addressing me, he said there's a whole generation of people that are Ilhan's age, who are from those parts of Africa where we are now seeing their first and only interaction with the United States is someone in a military outfit. And so that changes, right, the way in which someone thinks about America's presence and the way somebody thinks about whether this is someone that is there to help you or harm you. And I think that in so many ways, we have an opportunity to change the minds and the hearts of the world when we are engaging in spaces where there is aid and there is support that is not through avenues that can cause harm.
Thanks to you both. I have to say, we don't traditionally get, in excess of 100 people signing up for these conferences. So your presence here has really drawn a lot of people in, and we're starting to see the floodgates open on some questions. So if you don't mind, I'll turn now to a couple of audience questions and maybe try to merge them together to address some of the more consistent themes that we're seeing out there. And one really deals with, again, kind of what the public can do. And you mentioned, making phone calls and really the importance of getting the public involved. Are there other ways that you would recommend to either your constituents or the constituents of other members of Congress out there to get involved, either in their local districts or more generally speaking? And I know that you would also refer to things that organizations like those participating in this call could do. But if either of you had thoughts, and I think it becomes less awkward if I just call on you one at a time. But let's start with Representative Omar, and then we'll go to Representative Liu on this one.
Yeah, I mean, as Ted was saying earlier, I think it is important for the public to recognize that, hundreds of pieces of legislation are introduced every single month by members of Congress. And many of us might not even know about these pieces of legislation in order to even sign on to these pieces of legislation. Many of us are made aware that these even exist, that they need support by our constituents. So those phone calls to your member is important when you're engaging them to say, did you know Congresswoman introduced a bill in regards to this? Did you know, Congressman Ted Lieu introduced a bill to this? Can you sign on? Can you support it? Because the more support there is for these pieces of legislation, the more we are able to have a debate in our committees and possibly see these policies, move forward. And I think that, hosting local forums to generate more interest locally is of value. I do a lot of local conversations around these policies. I know that a lot of members in Congress might not, but also urging your member of Congress to have these conversations, to host forums on this, to again, make these issues as mainstream as is, funding healthcare and education, and forcing your members of Congress to recognize that they also have a role to play in advocating for a more just and peaceful world.
So I agree with everything that Councilwoman Omar said, and just two additional thoughts. I think folks can look at using social media. It's free. And in addition, if you sort of write a interesting post, maybe a member of Congress will see it, or maybe a voter in Ohio will see it, or someone in Florida. You never know how wide the reach could go. Congresswoman Omar has a great Twitter account. I want to let you know I have two. I have a very classy and polished office account, and then there's mine. But what's sort of interesting is, 20 years ago, let's say you wanted to say something to a member of Congress. It wasn't that easy, right? You have to try to either get a meeting or sort of get through 3 layers of staff before you can talk to a member of Congress on the phone, or try to catch them at a town hall. Now on social media, sometimes I'll get into conversations with constituents, or I'll see someone post a comment in response to a post that I did. And so you can sort of have an instantaneous direct line of communication to your member of Congress or to a senator in a way that never would have been possible 20 years ago. So I think that is sort of interesting. And I do learn sometimes from sort of reading the various comments to my posts and sort of engage in some of these conversations. So think about doing that. And then second is letters to the editor. Think about writing 1 or 2 or 3. You might not get published the first time, but eventually you will, because even though it turns out a bunch of people write letters to the editor, it also turns out many of them are the same people. So when you start writing in, and there are new voices coming in, at some point you will get published, and then that's a way to also influence people in a different way.
And I will say, Congressman Lieu does have a classic non-official Twitter as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people in our audience probably follow both of your Twitter handles. I know I do. And I just remind the audience and also your staffs that we're using hashtag Responsible Arms 2021, just a shameless plug for doing exactly what you described. I want to maybe add a kind of additional layer to this line of questioning that deals more with the political incentives and disincentives and in kind of more, I guess, maybe cynical terms of cost benefit analysis conducted by members, and some of whom have industry in their own backyards, and others that don't and really don't face those incentives, absent the kinds of pressure you're describing. So to kind of draw on a question that we got, a couple of questions we got, including one from Mike Stone of Reuters, do we think that there will be a day, or do you think even now members of Congress really have to think about electoral consequences when they're making decisions or choosing whether or not to vote on controversial arms sales? And then, as an alternative kind of way of looking at the question, are there ways to maybe ease the political costs for members of Congress who have manufacturing bases or companies in their own backyard who nonetheless want to sign up to support either restrictions or conditions or statements from Congress around controversial arms sales? So I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that. I'll turn to Congressman Liu to give him first right of refusal, and then we'll go from there.
I think sort of the perceived political pressure on members of Congress to vote for arms sales because, some defense companies might get mad at them is overblown. First of all, most of these arms, it's not, let's say it's anti-tank missiles. Well, most members of Congress probably don't actually have anti-tank missile manufacturers in their district. I get maybe the one that has like the headquarters might want to vote for that or whatever, but most people don't really think about arms sales. The constituents don't really talk about arms sales. It's just really not one of those issues that sort of rises to things that people think about. So I do think members of Congress can feel free to vote yes or no on arms sales. And unfortunately, what happens is they don't get that vote at all. It just never makes it. There's no debate. It never makes it to the House floor. So that's why I introduced that legislation, or at least let's cause a debate. Let's at least get people to think about this. Because sort of the way it works is basically if the Foreign Affairs Committee chair doesn't do anything, the arms sale just sort of goes through. And so I think it'd be more helpful if we actually made members of Congress think about these issues and vote on them.
Congresswoman Omar, do you have any additional thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with Ted on that. It's something that stops the debate doesn't even exist, and so getting to vote on some of these policies never really happens. And I will say, I think oftentimes because we are living in an extremely globalized world, many of us also have constituencies that might come from some of the countries where the weapons are being sold to, and countries where this debate involves. And so there might be pressure to support or not to support from some of these constituencies. I know that for me, interestingly, a lot of my pressure comes from people who are upset about the fact that I am so vocal against, the Yemen war and against the Saudi-led coalition and against selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Emirates and other places. Now I don't care for that pressure. And, I have reconciled the fears that sort of come in regards to my safety in being opposed to those. But I think for a lot of people, when there isn't a clear political incentive in these conversations, they will not involve themselves. Why have the headache if you know these policies are not going to move forward anyway, to insert yourself into this debate, knowing that there might be hell to pay in a way. And some of us still do, because we strongly believe from a value state point. But to those who don't have values grounded in peace and in human rights, it is easy to just be a bystander to this conversation and not involve yourself. So we have to create, I think, actual incentives for people to care about this. There has to be a political incentive, and that can come from their constituents who do have values of wanting a more peaceful world.
That's fascinating. And I think what's really compelling and interesting about both of your responses is it introduces this other question of, is it better to, well, I don't want to say better, because nobody wants a situation in which we're having to consider arms sales to a situation in which there are a lot of civilian casualties or human rights abuses, but at the same time that helps to galvanize kind of cross the aisle pressure for doing something differently. And at the same time, those kinds of situations focus attention on specific companies, specific sales, and create those political disincentives. Whereas if you're taking a more generalized approach to more reasonable policy, whether that's procedural changes or otherwise, you might lose that visceral appeal to doing something, but gain that kind of universal appeal. And I don't know if either of you have thoughts on like, what's the better approach? Is it to take advantage of, not in a cynical way, but to really push for change on the basis of real life situations where you can call attention to the consequences as a matter of strategy? Or is it more sensible to look for kind of universal approaches that would capture the full range of these issues as they come up? And I think we went to Representative Omar first last time, so I'll turn to Representative Liu first.
I think process can have a lot of effect on policy, and again, most of these arms sales get no debate. Members of Congress don't even know what's happening. It just sort of goes through. And I think if we can change the process to allow members of Congress to object and force a debate, that could alter policy. If the administration knew that they can't just sort of do these sales without much people paying attention, it might alter what they do in the future. And so I do think we should look at some procedural changes. And again, just have the administration come forward with a strategy and articulate why they're selling various arms to various countries.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, having a conversation about the procedural stuff allows for people, especially our constituents, to fully understand and be educated about the limitations that we have as members of Congress. Oftentimes, people will think that there is a role for you in a decision where there is no role, and that sort of universal understanding of what our role is in regards to making a decision on behalf of the country, and what the role of the executive is in regards to making decisions on behalf of the country, sometimes is not fully understood by everyone. Just for example, you had people thinking that the vice president had actual powers to change the results of an election. And, I might have only been in this country for 20 years, but for God's sake, I know this. My grandfather who spoke maybe, 20 words of English, knew this. But there are a lot of things that are not universally understood in our country. And the pieces of legislation we introduce, even though they are slow to gain support, allow us to have a conversation and bringing people into the fold on how this is supposed to work, how it actually can change, and how the current policy that is in place and the restrictions are creating a system that does not actually have the checks and balances that you normally think is associated in these situations.
You know, I'm old enough to remember when all vice presidents did was go to funerals and coronations, and when the most controversial thing was when the vice president couldn't spell potato. But we're well past those days now.
But we are currently living in a world where people think that the vice president is actually really powerful. So.
On this issue of process, and going back to the earlier conversation about what the administration can do coming in, we've had some questions around, you know, what a good partner to the Congress looks like in the administration. And Congressman Liu, you had mentioned, you know, showing up, sending, you know, witnesses to participate in hearings and to provide testimony. The issue of transparency has come up a couple of times. You know, starting with Representative Omar, do you have thoughts on things, gestures, approaches that the new administration can take to really restoring proper checks and balances and to being a good partner on arms sales and issues of significant consequence like arms sales in the national security and foreign policy arena?
Yeah, I mean, you know, as Ted alluded to earlier, not only did we not have a partnership with the administration as members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, there was an actual objection to us fulfilling our duties as members of Congress and as members of that committee. And, you know, our hope is that that automatically changes, right, with the incoming administration, and that there'll be a posture of collaboration. Now, there's a lot to do in cleaning up the mess that was created in the last 4 years. I mean, I sit on the oversight subcommittee, and, you know, we truly did not have the ability to do any sort of oversight. And so now we have to retroactively provide oversight of the things that have taken place in the last 4 years. And you know, the posture that we're looking for is that there will be collaboration, because we're not only reestablishing trust for members of Congress and members of the committee with the executive branch, we're also reestablishing trust with, you know, the international world. And secondly, it is going to be important for us to have a full understanding of what the agenda is and how they plan on incorporating us into that agenda as we move forward in the next 4 years.
Well, we've got time probably for about 2 more questions, maybe one shorter one, and then one to give you the opportunity to provide your last thoughts. But let me start with a little bit of a build off of that last question, which really that combines this issue of public support and participation in the process with Congress's role procedurally, and that deals with this issue of transparency. I can tell you, even as someone who follows these issues, it's not always easy to track what's happening with a particular sale, even once it's been notified to Congress, let alone ones that don't meet the threshold of being notified at all. Do either of you have thoughts or ideas or even plans of how that could change? Like, how the first step in the public getting more involved is knowing what's happening, either on a specific sale or procedurally. Do you have thoughts on transparency of process or specific transactions? And maybe to Representative Liu first on this one.
You know, it's so interesting. Last term, Congresswoman Omar and I were actually at a hearing where the issue was the Trump administration was basically increasing sort of the amount of small arms they could sell without notifying Congress, essentially. And so we objected to that, and hopefully, and taking other procedural shortcuts. So we're hopeful that the Biden administration will look at reversing that. It's also very welcome news for all of us that the Biden administration is much more supportive of alliances and working with allies and with other countries. I mean, they're going to put us back in the Paris Climate Accords. They're going to put us back into the World Health Organization. They think building alliances is a good thing. And so when you do that, it does make it somewhat harder to then sell arms to a country that could freak out other members of the alliance. And so hopefully just being a much more integral part of the entire world community instead of being sort of a lone actor would also sort of mitigate the administration just sort of randomly selling arms sales to countries where we shouldn't be doing so.
And I associate myself with everything Ted just said, but you know what, the one thing that I'm looking forward to the most is for us to no longer have a Trump fatigue. I mean, there's just so much that happens within a week that really, for us, you know, as soon as we draft one letter to inquire about, you know, some thing that they've acted on, there's 5 other things that come down the pipeline. And, you know, if we were having a hard time just keeping up, and, you know, we are going to have a normal president that goes through normal procedures and a normal timeline. And hopefully that will allow for us to utilize our time more effectively and efficiently as we try to get, you know, these things to be more transparent for the public.
Yeah, I've got so much to say about that pace of events and policy by Twitter, which we'll leave for another day. But that's incredibly insightful and helpful. I'm going to leave you both with one last question, and we believe in democracy in this country. But for a minute, I'm going to give you, you know, kind of unfettered power in choosing what the Congress does on arms sales in the next year and beyond. And maybe this is a conversation with the speaker, or another time when someone says, "What is the single most effective and doable thing Congress can do this year to improve the arms trade from its vantage point?" I'll give you both an opportunity to answer. I think I went to Representative Liu last time first, so I'll go to Representative Omar first, and then to Congressman Liu for the last word.
Pass our pieces of legislation. I mean,
exactly, you know, right.
Right. One, you know, help set red lines on arms sales. That's what my piece of legislation does. And, you know, Ted's gives us the ability to have oversight and insert ourselves in that decision making. So I don't know. I don't have a better wish list than that.
I agree completely with Congresswoman Omar. The other thing I want to note is one of the things that happened these past 4 years is because there's so much crazy stuff coming out of the White House and out of Donald Trump. It was hard for the press to talk about anything else, right? When the first 7 things were so crazy, just report on them. But hopefully in Biden administration, that's not going to happen. We're going to, you know, if we go to the days of when the worst thing is if Joe Biden wears a tan suit, right? And that's the news. Then what's going to happen is that's going to allow press to focus on other issues. And if press could focus more on arms sales or talk about, hey, look, this is arms sales to this country, and do an article on it, I think that would also be very helpful. And so I look forward to that, when the reporting will no longer be, you know, next crazy thing the president did, but rather about all these other issues that are happening in Congress and in America.
Yeah, hopefully governing by tweets ends.
Well, it's already that has already ended, so that's good.
I just have to say thanks on behalf of our audience, but also the Forum on the Arms Trade and Civic, not only for participating today, but, you know, no matter what anybody's political views are, it's really wonderful to see, you know, you both having led the charge to develop some affirmative options for the Congress on this, you know, this issue of incredible consequence for American national security and foreign policy and our role in the world. So thanks to you both. And we hope to see you again next year. Congresswoman Omar, Representative Liu will tell you, once you've done one, you're now enlisted to come to all of the other sessions from here on out.
A great club to be part of.
Absolutely.
But thank you both.
Thank you.
Let me, in closing, let me briefly remind our audience that you can find the Forum on the Arms Trade at its home online at forumarmstrade.org, where all the events of today will be recorded and posted, I believe, also at the Stimson website and Civic's website. And I just want to briefly just mention that this event could not have come together without a small army of people working very hard to pull it together, especially virtually, which is tough. The staff of both of our members of Congress here want to give a shout out to the schedulers and the press people and the policy and legislative advisors in those offices, especially Ryan and Corey, who've been outstanding to work with. And then with the Security Assistance Monitor, I want to give a shout out to Elias Youssef, my colleague Annie Scheel, who's just amazing, Ray Gerard from Dawn, Jeff Abramson of the Arms Control Association and director of the forum, and of course my brilliant and co-moderator and host of the event, Rachel Stoll, and so many other volunteers who came together. And then I also want to thank all of the other panelists who were able to join today for giving some of their time. But with that, I will thank once again our two members of Congress for joining and leave them to very busy times over on the Hill and important issues. And once again, thank our entire audience for joining today, and we'll look forward to being in touch. And again, don't forget #ResponsibleArmsTrade 2021 on Twitter. And I'm at Dan Mahanti.